Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today we have a fun and exciting holiday project for you. These are the mini mushroom ornaments. They're a bunch of fun to make because there's a ton of different styles and colors to really dress up your tree, and they go along really well with the birdhouse ornaments we've shown you in another video. The great thing about this project is it doesn't require any special materials or anything like that. I just used some scrap wood to turn these, but you can get a lot of good tool practice as well as just aesthetics and shapes, different designs, and good practice for turning. And in the video, we'll cover all the turning steps for this, and I'll be using primarily the skew for the majority of this project, so stick around if you want to see some different tool technique ideas with the skew. But let's get to the lathe and start turning. For the mini mushroom ornament project, we're going to be using an inch and a half by roughly 4 inches long. You can adjust the sizes plus or minus, depending on the size of mushroom ornaments you want to make. But this was just some scrap wood I had lying around, so this is what I'm going to use. And the first thing we need to do is we need to get this blank to round and put a small little tenon on there so that way we can remount it securely and turn it without our tailstock in place. I've left my chuck jaws a little loose so I can adjust the end of this blank to its center point because I know I didn't cut it squarely on my bandsaw. Once I get that center point lined up with that revolving center, I can clamp this down. Gripping in the jaws on a square blank like this doesn't give us a very secure hold, so we want to make sure we have our tailstock until we get this thing trued up with a tenon. We'll get our tool rest adjusted, get our working height set the way we need it. For my planing cuts with my skew, I like to have it just a little bit above center. It makes it a little bit easier, especially on those bigger round pieces when you're doing larger diameter spindles. But first thing we need to do, we'll turn this on, bring it up to speed, and we'll be using the 1-inch skew to do some planing cuts on here and get this close to round on the end. Throw a small little tenon on there to fit our chuck jaws, and we'll just clean up those torn fibers right there, and then we'll just do a small little slicing cut here as well. That's going to clean up those end grain fibers. And then we'll just pick that up, take that into the corner, and then I'll also throw a small chamfer with a little V-cut right there. That should be good for what we need as far as our chuck jaws go. Let's just make sure this fits. Okay. That's going to give us a lot better hold in the chuck than just gripping on these four corners there. So now that we have that in place, I'll keep my tailstock up here just for the planing cuts, getting this to round. If you're going to be doing heavy aggressive peel cuts with the skew, keep that tailstock engaged. With that 1-inch skew, we can do some peel cuts. That's going to get rid of material really quickly. That's just going to get those sharp corners knocked off really quick. And then we can go back to a planing cut to give us a better surface. If we look at what the skew leaves behind, it gives us a really clean surface. You can see that we have a little bit of a chip out there from being a little aggressive. Now that we have this to round, we can get rid of our tailstock and start working on our shaping. First thing I want to do is get my parting tool and lay out the measurements for our mushroom. I've got a little bit of waste material here that we're going to have to get rid of. So I'm going to account for roughly 1/16 of an inch of waste. And then if I grab one of our mushrooms, I can just hold this up here and eyeball it. The mushroom head's going to be about that tall, maybe just a hair more. And then we'll do our stem about yay long. So about 3/4 of an inch in length on the head there, and then we're probably about 2 inches on the stem, and you can adjust those depending on whatever shape you like. We'll bring up our tool rest just a little bit closer, and we'll do a peel cut just to clean up the end here. Get rid of that little nub. Now that we have this established, we'll go to our parting tool, and I'm just going to part down some of this material so we can start shaping the head. And I don't want to go too skinny because we still want the strength there as we're shaping. I don't want to make that too skinny on the stem and go to our final size and then try shaping this and having it chatter on us and move. So once we have that laid out where we need it, we can start doing some V cuts here to clean up the bottom underside of the mushroom head. That parting tool is going to leave behind a really poor surface. And I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see on that side from the camera on that side, but that gives us a really clean surface on the back side here. Now let's start shaping the head, and I'm going to switch to a smaller skew. So we were using the 1 inch before. I'm going to go to a 1/2 inch. I find it a lot easier for me to finesse the 1/2 inch skew and get the radius and shape that I need versus that 1 inch. It's a little bit unwieldy in that regard. So we'll start by just rounding this over. Anytime we're working with that skew, we want to make sure that bevel is engaged before we start our cut. And depending on the shape of the mushroom you want, if you want like this classic style here or just the full half dome, you could do that skew and just do one big half round here on the head. But we're going to go for a slightly OG shape here. It's got a bit of a cove to a radius. I'll establish my radius on this side as well. The thing with that skew is you got to make sure that bevel contact's in place throughout the cut. Otherwise, if it slips off and is just on the cutting edge, it's going to skate and have a pretty good catch for us. To do the cove on there, doing a cove with a skew is really difficult, and I'm not the best at it. But you can do the long point down to get a little bit of a cove if that's what you're looking for. Once we get the cove, we can then blend that shape. So I'm going to give us the cove first, and then we can blend the top of this head to that half round, and we can radius over this to our cove as well. So I'm going to start with that bevel, making sure to roll that. Still a little bit heavy there. Do a little bit more of a cove. Then we can radius this just ever so slightly. Let's use some V cuts here to remove some material. And we can use that long point down to get that radius we're looking for on our mushroom. If I can pick up the cut. Anytime you're using the long point down to get a radius on there, I like to start contacting the wood here where that black section meets the ground section. Right here on the corner, that gives me basically a frame of reference, an index point to then start moving that handle to bring that cutting edge where I need it to be. Instead of floating my cutting edge and hoping I'm on the bevel leading up to a catch, I like to index that off the tool, and then I'll swing the handle towards me, and that's going to bring that cutting edge where I need it. Okay, we're starting to get the shape we need. This side of the bevel looks nice and rounded. I need to smooth this out just a bit. If you don't want to do that with the skew, you can use your spindle gouge to do the same thing. It's not going to leave us as clean of a surface, but it is going to be a little bit easier to use. Doing a cove with a spindle gouge is the more appropriate tool for a cove specifically, but it can be done with the skew. But spindle gouge is definitely going to be a lot easier. So we smoothed out the cove. Now let's smooth out the top of our mushroom head here. I'm going to index that off that part of the tool that we mentioned. And then as soon as we see that start cutting, I bring that handle towards me, and that's going to keep that cutting edge from catching. Alright, so I'm happy with the shape of that top of the mushroom. There's just a tiny bit of a nub, so I'm going to bring that skew back in place and pick that up right there at the dead center, just to flatten that out, just a hair. I think that looks a lot better. So we got that nice little OG sweep to it. We need to blend this transition from here to there. I'm going to pick that up right here at the top. We're using short point down. Just lightly cutting, just to feather that. And then we'll continue this all the way down. If you don't get the right tool motion the first time, but you're still on the bevel, you can always just back the tool up and then re-engage that cut. There, I think that looks pretty good. I do want to have this slightly concave here from this radius to the stem, and we can do that with a series of long point down kind of V cuts. This is going to give us a really clean surface. That's the great thing with the skew, is it's all bevel riding cuts, slicing cuts, and it leaves us a really clean surface. I'm going to go back to our 1-inch skew and just do some peels just to get rid of some of this excess material. Now that we've done the shaping on the head and we're done over here on the end, we can go to our skew and do some good planing cuts in here. And we can flip that over and go long point into that corner. If there's too much material in the way, we'll do a series of V cuts just to get through the material. When I'm getting that teardrop shape, basically I'm keeping my hand anchored on my tool rest and I'm just pivoting off that, getting that same motion with the tool, making sure it's always a bevel riding cut. Pushing just a touch too hard with the bevel. I want to make sure when I pick that cut up, just light pressure on the bevel. I'm going to go to that long point down here and cut that into the corner nice and clean. Just double check that our surface here is cut well. I've got a little bit of chatter I need to cut through and give myself a clean surface, because I don't want to come back here once we start getting that stem down, you know, under a 1/4 inch in diameter. Continue on with that teardrop shape. Okay. But now let's give ourselves a V cut here. That's going to give us our area where this piece is going to end, and it will give us a clean separation when we do cut this off. So a series of V cuts just to get material out of our way. Then we can go ahead and get our half round for that teardrop shape. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Just going to shorten that up ever so slightly. Use some V cuts in there just to get rid of some more material. But before we get that too thin, let's go ahead and sand as much of this as we can, because once we start getting that final radius on the bottom of the teardrop here, we're not going to have a lot of material to then put any pressure on with sandpaper. So before we keep going, let's grab our sandpaper and we'll drop our speed down. And these surfaces are left pretty clean behind from the tool. You can see that burnish. And usually we can start with about 320 or 240, but now we'll just blend that OG curve and get rid of any excess bevel marks or any bevel rubs. But the surface is cut clean. We don't have any tear out, anything like that we have to worry about. But the great thing about this project though is you can turn out a bunch of these really fast. Obviously I'm trying to teach and talk as I do it, so I'd be turning a little bit slower than I normally would. But these, should be about a 10-15 minute project aside from your finishing process and whatever you do that way. So we'll go into our 320 grit now. And once we have this smoothed out, we also need to drill the small little hole for our eyelet screw. And then we'll give ourselves a small little dimple with the skew, just to help this little bit that's super flexible find a good center point. It doesn't have to be much, just enough to get that brad point, just to find its center point. And we're drilling about a 1/4 inch deep, or you can go less. I like to have enough room in there for that glue so it doesn't squeeze back out when I press the screw in. If you want to, depending on whatever additive or additional decoration you want to do to these, you can color them, you can leave them natural, you can paint them like we've done in the ones we've shown you. We dyed it first and then we added just some little dots on there, give it a little extra color. I think this looks really good, and so I'm going to get my marker and I'm going to dye the top of this thing red before we go ahead and part this off. Just using a paper towel just to get rid of any dust, because that'll clog up the tips of these markers pretty quick if there's a bunch of dust on the surface. And then I'm going to drop the speed down nice and low, just a few hundred RPM a minute. And we're using the felt tip. These are the Tombow markers. This is a really good marker for tops, spindle projects. We showed you on the German smoker kits using these markers. As you're going across the surface, just make sure to rotate the marker so the tip doesn't dry out. And then I'll go back and forth across the surface a few times just to make sure that we're getting an even saturation of color. One thing I like to do is, if I'm using these quite frequently, I like to have a few of each color. That way, as this one's drying out, because we're covering a lot of surface area here, that way I can just cap it, grab another red, and keep going. So I know that requires a fair investment in markers, but if you're doing a lot of small spindle projects, these things are quite handy. All right, just double check that you have a good even saturation of color, and there's a bunch of different colors to choose from as well. So like you saw in the introduction shot of this video, we had a bunch of different colored mushrooms, and you can get really creative with them. But once we have that colored and sanded as much as we can on the stem, let's go ahead and get our skew. Bring our speed back up, and we'll be using the skew to do a slicing cut, V-cut basically, to cut this off, as well as get that final teardrop half round here on the bottom. So a series of V-cuts. I'm going to remove excess material. And it might seem like a nervous tick a little bit to always wipe off the edge of the skew between cuts, but I like being able to see exactly where that cutting edge is, and if there's a bunch of shavings or dust on there, it makes it kind of hard to see. And I'm going to stop before I get all the way to the bottom, just in case I need a reprofile, or if you have a catch or something like that. That way there's, your piece isn't off the lathe at that point. Some small V-cuts. Paring material down. Again, you can see I'm riding that bevel right here, establishing where I am in relationship to my cutting edge, and then I can come back in here and make the series of cuts. Just small, tiny little bites. I want to get this as small as I can while it's still on the lathe. That way, if I need to, I can lightly resand the bottom of our radius there. I'm going to go to my 320. And just lightly touch this surface. We're getting clean cuts off that bevel riding cut with our skew, but I just want to make sure that's as finished as possible before we cut this off. As I'm doing this, I'm going to start supporting this a little bit with my hand, and I'm indexing my middle finger here on the bottom edge of my rest. That way I have my hand's not just floating around in space, and I'm pinching the stem of this mushroom between my thumb and forefinger. And then we'll keep working those series of V-cuts, and this should give us a really clean surface with minimal tear out or plucked fibers on the very bottom. This is a bit of a delicate cut here and a little tricky, but with that skew basically vertical at the very bottom, that's going to leave us a really clean surface down here. Once you have that parted off, we can grab that 320 grit paper and just hold that in the palm of your hand. Just go around in a circular fashion, and that'll give us a nice clean surface on the bottom of that. So that's a really good way of using the skew to cut the end of this really clean, because most of the time people usually just use a parting tool and cut that off, and they'll have a big chunk of torn grain right on the bottom of that ornament, and it just doesn't look very good when you're finished. So once you have this parted off and you have it colored, we'll take this outside, spray lacquer it, throw some little dots on there, and throw our eyelet in, and that's going to be done. But let's go ahead and turn just another one of these in a different shape, just to give you more examples and give you some creative ideas. Alright, so we're going to turn another one of these in a little bit different shape. This time I'm not going to be talking as much, we're just going to be going through the process just so you can see it again. And as we do this, I'll just throw out little tips here and there, but we're just going to try and zip through this just to show you some different shapes. So again, we just need to get this to round and throw a tenon on. I can see that my tailstock's not spinning at the same RPM as the chuck is, so I know my support from the tailstock is very poor. But we're ready to flip this around right now. Bring that up just as I do some peeling cuts. Here. Actually switch to my 1/2 inch. Still a bit pointy, I'm going to switch to long point down and pick up the cut right there at the very end. Just blending that radius, making that just a little bit smoother and nice and more rounded as well. Tiny bit of a nub, starting on that bevel, picking up the cut with that leading edge. I wouldn't normally be cutting this down this early, but I want you to be able to see that slicing cut from this angle. So we'll come back in here. Again, I like to engage that bevel right there just to make sure where I am. You never want to try and make that entry cut with the tip first on the side there. Usually you're going to start that out here on the end where you can see what's going on. If we start that halfway through the cut and you're going in just tip first, you're going to get a catch. I always like to engage bevel first and then swing that around until that cutting edge engages. Just going to clean up the edge of the mushroom, make sure I'm on bevel first, and then I'm just going to pick that up. I had a little bit of torn fiber right there on the very end. I wanted to make sure that was cleaned up. And same thing here, bevel first, and then we engage that long point. First time you use that long point on a planing cut kind of action like that, it feels like you're going to be getting a catch every single time because it looks really weird. But it's a really good cut. Now I'm going to start here at the rim. Get a nice slice. If I need to, I can support that a little bit with my fingers. If you slip off the bevel, like if you just saw that, I slipped off the bevel just a little bit, so I can always stay on the bevel, back up, and then adjust the handle again until that cutting edge starts engaging. I'm going to throw just a slight chamfer here, a little V-cut. make that not so sharp on the very edge of the mushroom. Then let's go ahead and keep necking this down. There we go, I think that looks a little bit better. Series of V-cuts. And then get a nice skate when you're trying to go back in for a V-cut in an area you weren't trying to cut. We'll use short point down. Sometimes short point's a little bit easier to get that half radius that you're looking for and get a better shape. Go ahead and sand and drill this. This surface left behind with the skew is super clean, so I'm going to start with 320. And that's super clean off the skew. Honestly, you really don't even need to sand it. Bevel writing cut off of a skew is super clean and it's burnished. Now that we're done sanding, let's go ahead and grab our skew. We'll throw that small dimple for our drill bit. Again, 1/4 inch is all we need with that drill bit. I'll be using a dark blue on this one. Okay, I'm happy with the dye on that one. Let's go ahead and do our basically V grooves to part this off with the skew. I'll get that rest nice and close again. Bring that speed back up, and again I'm staying with the 1/2 inch skew. I find the 1 inch for these detail things to be just a little bit unwieldy. Okay, we're almost through. I can feel the mushroom flexing. A series of V-cuts, and then we'll cut this off nice and clean. Once you have these done, and you have a whole bunch of them, let the dye from the markers dry. It's a water-based dye, so give them just a few minutes, let them dry. I'll throw a coat of spray lacquer on these, and then we'll throw the white paint on to give us those dots. And then we'll throw just a quick protective coat over that acrylic paint that we put on the top, and then we can glue in the eyelet screws. But we'll take these outside, throw our spray lacquer on. If you don't know how to use the spray lacquer finish, check out one of our other videos. We show you how to use that in depth. So we'll be right back. Alright, so we've got our toadstools decorated with some acrylic paint, then we put on a nice coat of spray lacquer. So these things are all finished up and ready to go. We just need to glue in our eyelet screws, and then we can hang these straight on our tree. So the hole that we drilled for our eyelet screws is quite a bit larger than the screw itself. That's going to give us a little bit extra room for that glue. That way we don't have any glue squeeze out and come out onto the top of this mushroom. But when I glue this in, I'm going to be using, this is the film finish. It's basically a thick CA, and then I have the whip tip on there. That's going to help me get that glue exactly where I need it, because I don't want any glue on this spray lacquered surface. It's going to be unsightly and there's not going to be any way to get it off. So we'll just put that whip tip straight down in the drilled hole. And we'll put in just a small amount, just enough to where it's about halfway up the drilled hole, not all the way to the top, because as soon as we press that screw in, it's going to squeeze out the extra glue. And then as far as the activator goes, I'm just going to spray some activator directly on the screw itself. And then I'm going to drop that down into the drilled hole. And then slowly press that in, allow those air bubbles to work around, that way you're not forcing glue out of the top. And then just barely touch that with just a little bit of activator. The chemicals in activators can tend to eat the spray lacquer finish that you might have on here. So if you overspray it with the activator, it's going to ruin your finish. So we'll let that one sit off to the side and fully cure for just a minute. And then we'll do the same thing to this one as well. I'm going to hold that screw down this time. Spray the activator directly on that. That's also going to help get that activator down deep under that first layer of CA, because anytime you have a really thick layer of CA, the top will skin over and cure, and it takes a while for that to fully activate all the way through the glue. But with some of the activator directly on that screw all the way down in the bottom, that's going to help cure that faster. So we'll just set these off to the side for just a minute. And then I just got some wire from the craft store to make some little hooks to hang on the tree. And then we can throw those on there and just put this straight on our tree. But I think these are a really cute, fun decoration, and the great thing about this is it doesn't require a lot of materials or anything to turn these, and it's just a great skill builder as well as being a really cute functional decoration. So in this video we covered how to turn these with the skew and the spindle gouge. We did a bunch of really cool cuts that you can practice and get a lot of time in at the lathe while you're turning these. They're really fast to make, really cheap to make, and they're just a lot of fun. So if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them in the comment section down below. And as always, subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos.